The doors of the Highland Manor burst open with a sound like thunder. Rain lashed across the stone steps. Wind tore at the woman's cloak as she stood there, soaked, breathless, trembling not from cold but from the fury that had carried her across an ocean. A servant gasped somewhere in the shadows. Behind the grand hall's flickering candles, the most feared man in Scotland slowly lifted his head. The Duke of Somerset had not received visitors in 3 years, yet here she stood, and the first words she spoke shattered the silence like glass. "You ruined my brother," she said. Gasps rippled through the dim hall. The woman's voice did not tremble. Louisa Harding had crossed the Atlantic for this moment. Every sleepless night aboard the creaking merchant ship, every mile through fog-choked roads and bitter Highland rain had led to the man standing before her. The Duke, Julian Ashford. He was taller than she expected, not the polished aristocrat she had imagined during those 42 nights on the ocean. No immaculate waistcoat, no polished boots, no elegant indifference. Instead, a man who looked as though the world had already destroyed him. His dark hair fell too long around his face. His shirt was open at the throat, wrinkled and carelessly worn. A faint shadow of beard roughened his jaw. Yet the moment his green eyes lifted to meet hers, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. There was power there. Even broken, the Duke of Somerset carried the quiet gravity of a man society had once bowed to. "You must be mistaken," he said calmly. His voice was deep and hoarse from disuse. Louisa stepped forward, rain dripping from her cloak onto the marble floor. "Jonathan Harding," she said. The name hung in the air like a blade. For the briefest moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, then guilt. The Duke turned away slightly, pouring amber liquor into a crystal glass with a hand that betrayed the faintest tremor. "I remember the name." Louisa felt the words strike her chest like a hammer. Remember, as if her brother were merely another entry in a ledger, another unfortunate investment, another life discarded in aristocratic games. Her hands curled into fists beneath her cloak. "You remember?" she repeated quietly. The Duke lifted the glass but did not drink. "He invested in the Somerset Mining Consortium," Julian said. "He trusted you," Louisa snapped. The Duke's jaw tightened. "He trusted my judgment," Julian corrected. "And your judgment destroyed him." Silence swallowed the hall. Somewhere a log shifted in the hearth. Louisa watched him closely now. This was the monster she had imagined for months. The arrogant nobleman who had ruined her brother and sent him home in disgrace, only for illness and exhaustion to finish the work grief had begun. But something about the man before her refused to match the image she had carried across the sea. Monsters did not look this tired. Monsters did not hesitate before drinking. The Duke set the glass down untouched. "What is it you want from me, Miss Harding?" he asked quietly. Louisa stiffened. "How do you know my name?" "Your brother spoke of you," Julian said. The words struck her like a physical blow. "Spoke of you?" A memory rose unbidden. Boston. A warm summer evening. Jonathan laughing as he leaned against the library window, pointing toward the stars. "One day I'll build something extraordinary, Lou. Something Father would be proud of." The memory shattered. "You promised him success," Louisa said. "I promised opportunity. You promised fortune. I promised nothing guaranteed." "He believed you." Julian's voice sharpened suddenly. "So did I." The confession stunned her. For the first time since she entered the house, the Duke looked directly at her, not with arrogance, not with irritation, but with something dangerously close to shame. "The venture collapsed," he said quietly. "Banks failed, investors fled. I lost every estate in England except this one." His hand gestured vaguely around the enormous yet decaying manor. "You lost money," Louisa said. "My brother lost his life." The words cut deeper than anything before them. Julian closed his eyes briefly. When he spoke again, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. "I know." Louisa stared at him. That was not the response she expected. No defense. No noble arrogance. Just two simple words. She felt her anger falter for the first time. That terrified her more than hatred ever had. "I crossed an ocean to confront you," she said. Julian opened his eyes again. Rain battered the tall windows behind him. "And now that you have," he asked softly, "what will you do?" Louisa did not hesitate. "I'm staying." The Duke frowned slightly. "This is not a boarding house." "No," she said. Her voice steadied with a certainty that had carried her across thousands of miles. "It's a prison." She stepped closer. "And I intend to make sure you remember exactly why." For the first time since she entered Glenmore Manor, the Duke of Somerset truly looked at her. Not as an intruder, not as an annoyance, but as something far more dangerous. A witness, a living reminder of every name he had tried to bury beneath whiskey and silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the highlands. Inside the ruined manor, something far more unsettling had begun. Because Julian Ashford had spent 3 years hiding from the world, and now the world had arrived at his door. In the form of a woman with amber eyes and a grief sharp enough to destroy them both. Morning arrived at Glenmore Manor without warmth. Grey Highland mist rolled across the moor and pressed itself against the tall windows like a silent accusation. The once grand estate looked less like a noble residence and more like a wounded animal retreating into fog. Louisa Harding had slept little. Her room, if it could be called that, was a narrow servant chamber beneath the eaves, offered by the housekeeper with a wary glance and a warning she had not bothered to soften. The Duke is not a man people stay near for long. Louisa had answered simply. I did not come here to stay comfortably. Now she descended the narrow staircase with the quiet determination of a woman who had already burned the bridges behind her. The kitchen smelled of coal smoke and baking bread. Mrs. Campbell stood at the long wooden table kneading dough with powerful hands shaped by decades of work. Her sharp Highland eyes lifted as Louisa entered. You're still here, the older woman said. Louisa tied a borrowed apron around her waist. I said I would be. Mrs. Campbell studied her in silence for a moment. Most who arrive shouting accusations leave by sunrise. I am not most people. That much is clear. The housekeeper nodded toward the bread. Then you may help. If you're staying, you'll work. Louisa began slicing the loaves without complaint. The steady rhythm grounded her thoughts, though her mind refused to stop replaying the encounter in the hall. The Duke had not argued. He had not threatened. He had simply accepted the accusation as though it belonged to him. That unsettled her far more than arrogance would have. Footsteps echoed somewhere above. Louisa stiffened. Mrs. Campbell did not look up. He won't come down, the woman muttered. He never does. But the footsteps continued. Slow. Measured. And then, the Duke of Somerset appeared in the doorway. Both women froze. Julian Ashford looked different in daylight. Still unshaven, still weary. Yet the morning light revealed the sharp aristocratic structure beneath the exhaustion. Broad shoulders, strong jaw. A face society would once have admired in every ballroom from London to Edinburgh. But the green eyes remained haunted. He paused when he saw Louisa. Clearly he had not expected her to remain. I see you survived the night, he said. His tone was neutral, almost polite. Louisa set down the knife. I intend to survive many more. Julian stepped into the kitchen. Mrs. Campbell stared openly now. You came down for breakfast. I was curious, he replied calmly. About what? He glanced at Louisa. About whether Miss Harding meant what she said. Louisa met his gaze without flinching. I rarely say things I do not mean. The Duke regarded her for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, he sat at the plain wooden table. A duke, once one of the wealthiest men in England, sitting in a servant's kitchen as if titles had never existed. Mrs. Campbell placed tea before him with visible confusion. You have not eaten here in 3 years, she said. Julian lifted the cup. There is a first time for everything. Louisa watched him carefully. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from something else. Withdrawal. The sharp scent of whiskey lingered faintly on him, though none stood near. You expected me to leave, she said. Yes. And you hoped? Julian did not answer immediately. The Duke stirred his tea slowly, watching the swirling liquid as if searching for something within it. At first, he said quietly, I hoped you would. And now? His gaze lifted. Now she saw it clearly. Not arrogance. Not cruelty, but a deep, bone-tired resignation. Now, he said softly, I suspect you will not. Louisa felt something tighten in her chest. No. She folded her hands on the table. I will not. Silence spread across the room. Outside, wind bent the tall heather grasses across the moor. Julian leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with the same careful attention a man might give a dangerous animal. You crossed the Atlantic, he said. You tracked me across England. Yes. You entered my home uninvited. Yes. And now you intend to remain here indefinitely? Louisa's voice was calm. Until I decide otherwise. Mrs. Campbell made a quiet noise of disbelief. Julian, however, only nodded slowly. Very well. Louisa blinked. You accept that? What alternative do I have? You could throw me out. The Duke's lips curved faintly. Forcibly removing the sister of a man I ruined would hardly improve my reputation. The quiet honesty of the remark startled her. Julian pushed his untouched bread aside. You said you came to make sure I remember. I did. He leaned forward slightly. I remember every one of them, Miss Harding. His voice lowered. Your brother, the investors, the families, the lives that collapsed with mine. Louisa felt her anger flicker uncertainly. I don't believe that. Julian's gaze sharpened. Then stay. The words were simple, unemotional, yet something beneath them carried weight. Stay as long as you wish, he continued quietly. Walk these halls, watch me live with it. His hand tightened around the teacup. If witnessing my failure is what brings you peace, and I will not stop you. The room fell silent again. Louisa realized suddenly that this confrontation was not unfolding as she had imagined during the long crossing. The Duke did not fight. He did not defend himself. He simply endured, and somehow, that made him far more difficult to hate. Julian rose from the table. I will be in the library, he said. Then he paused at the doorway. Without looking back, he added quietly, if you intend to haunt this house, Miss Harding, you may as well make it livable again. The door closed behind him. Mrs. Campbell stared after him. Well, she muttered. That is the most he has spoken to anyone since the scandal. Louisa looked toward the corridor where the Duke had disappeared. Her anger still burned, but beneath it something far more unsettling had begun to stir, because the man she had come to destroy did not behave like a villain, and if the Duke of Somerset was not the monster she imagined, then vengeance might prove far more complicated than crossing an ocean. The library of Glenmore Manor had once been magnificent. Even in neglect, Louisa could see it. Tall walnut shelves climbed toward a painted ceiling darkened by smoke and years of silence. Velvet curtains hung heavy beside towering windows that overlooked the endless Highland moor. Dust softened everything, like a memory no one dared disturb. Louisa stepped inside carrying a cloth and a small bucket. The Duke of Somerset sat near the fireplace, a stack of papers spread across the desk before him. He did not look up when she entered. I assumed, he said evenly, you would choose the West Wing first. It leaks less. Louisa set the bucket down. I did not ask your advice. I did not offer it. She moved to the nearest shelf and began removing books one by one. Dust rose in pale clouds. For several minutes neither spoke. The quiet was not peaceful. It was the careful silence of two people measuring each other. Finally, Julian's voice broke it. You truly intend to clean the entire house? Louisa did not look at him. If I am forced to live in your prison, Your Grace, I prefer it not resemble a tomb. He almost smiled. Glenmore has resembled a tomb for quite some time. That seems to be your preference. Julian leaned back in the chair. My preference, he said quietly, has rarely mattered. Louisa turned sharply. Your preference built the mining company that destroyed my brother. The Duke did not flinch. That is true. The admission irritated her. You do not even try to defend yourself. What defense would satisfy you? Louisa opened a window with more force than necessary. Cold Highland air rushed inside. You could begin by explaining why a duke needed the savings of a young American merchant to fund his ventures. Julian finally looked at her. Because I believed ambition should not belong only to aristocrats. The answer caught her off guard. He continued calmly. The consortium was meant to open investment to men outside the old families, merchants, engineers, entrepreneurs. And it failed. Yes. Louisa crossed her arms. And when it failed, you retreated here to drink yourself into oblivion. His gaze darkened slightly. You believe that was my first instinct? Was it not? Julian stood slowly. The movement revealed just how tall he truly was. He walked toward the tall windows and looked out at the bleak sweep of heather. For 2 years, he said quietly, I sold everything I owned. Louisa frowned. What? The London townhouse, the Somerset hunting lodge, half the southern estate. He turned toward her again. I paid every creditor I could. Louisa's breath caught. That is not what people say. No. A faint bitterness entered his voice. Society prefers a simpler story. She searched his face. You expect me to believe you sacrificed your fortune trying to repay them? I expect nothing from you. His words were calm, but the exhaustion in them felt ancient. I only answer the question you asked. Louisa felt the steady certainty she had carried across the ocean begin to crack. You could still repay more, she said. With what? He gestured around the library. This house is the only Somerset property left. The truth in his voice made her uneasy. You are still a duke, and titles do not produce gold. He stepped closer now. Tell me something honestly, Miss Harding. His green eyes held hers. When your brother invested, did he write that I forced him? No. Did he claim I threatened him? No. Then why are you here? The question struck deeper than she expected. Louisa's throat tightened. Because he trusted you. Julian absorbed the words quietly. And you believe trust alone makes me guilty of his death? You gave him hope. Yes. The Duke's voice softened, and I would give that hope again. Louisa stared at him in disbelief. You would risk more lives? No. Julian shook his head slowly. I would still believe men deserve opportunity. His gaze held a quiet conviction she had not expected. Your brother believed that too. The mention of Jonathan sent a familiar ache through her chest. Louisa turned away abruptly, wiping dust from a book that was already clean. He died believing in you? Julian's voice dropped almost to a whisper. I know. For the first time since arriving at Glenmore, Louisa noticed something else. His hands. They trembled slightly at his sides, not with weakness, with restraint. You carry it, she said slowly. The guilt. Julian gave a humorless laugh. You think guilt is something I carry? His eyes met hers again. It is something I drown in. The honesty startled her. For a long moment they simply stood there, the wind whispering through the open window. Louisa had imagined many things about the Duke of Somerset during the long ocean crossing. Arrogance, cruelty, indifference. She had never imagined regret, and that realization unsettled her more than anger ever had. Julian stepped back toward the desk. If cleaning the library is part of your revenge, he said quietly, you may continue. Louisa hesitated. Then she spoke before she could stop herself. My brother admired you. Julian froze. Louisa swallowed. He wrote that you were different from other aristocrats, that you listened, that you respected men who worked. The Duke did not move. I suppose, she said softly, that is why the betrayal hurt him so much. Julian's shoulders lowered slightly. When he spoke, the words sounded almost like a confession. I admired him too. Louisa stared. You did not know him. Julian shook his head. I knew enough. His voice carried something deeper now. Your brother was brave enough to risk everything for a future he believed in. He looked at the empty fireplace. I wish I had been brave enough to save him. The quiet admission hung in the air. Louisa felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not even sympathy, but the first fragile fracture in the hatred she had carried across the ocean. And the thought terrified her, because vengeance was simple when the enemy was a monster. But the Duke of Somerset, the man standing before her now, was beginning to look dangerously human. 2 weeks passed at Glenmore Manor. The house no longer felt entirely abandoned. Louisa opened windows that had not moved in years. Curtains were beaten free of dust. Fires burned in rooms long surrendered to cold. Even the echoing corridors began to hold the faint sounds of life again. Yet the strangest transformation was not the house. It was the Duke. Julian Ashford no longer remained upstairs until noon. He appeared most mornings in the library while Louisa worked, reading correspondence or staring out at the endless stretch of moorland beyond the windows. They rarely spoke for long, yet the silence between them had changed. It was no longer hostile. It was watchful, careful, as though each of them feared disturbing something fragile neither yet understood. On a gray afternoon, Louisa discovered the locked cabinet. She had been dusting the far end of the library when her cloth brushed against a narrow wooden door hidden beside the shelves. It was old, the brass keyhole dark with age. Your Grace, she called. Julian looked up from the desk. What is it? This cabinet. He stiffened almost imperceptibly. It is locked. That is intentional. Louisa studied him. You keep secrets in it. Julian leaned back slowly in his chair. I keep records. Of what? His gaze shifted briefly toward the cabinet, then back to her. Of everyone who lost money in the consortium. Louisa frowned. You kept a list? Yes. Why? Julian stood. His movements were measured, reluctant, because names should not disappear simply because they become inconvenient. He crossed the room and produced a small key from his waistcoat pocket. Louisa's heartbeat quickened as he unlocked the door. Inside were ledgers, dozens of them, each spine carefully labeled. Investors, families, settlements. Louisa reached for one without asking permission. The pages were filled with precise handwriting, names, amounts owed, dates, notes beside many entries. Some were marked payday, others, partial repayment. Some had only one word beside them, dead. Her fingers froze. Why keep this? She asked quietly. Julian closed the cabinet door halfway, because forgetting would be convenient. And? His eyes met hers. I have not earned convenience. Louisa looked back at the pages. There were hundreds of names, more than she had imagined. You tried to repay them, she said slowly. For 2 years. And then you stopped. Yes. Why? Julian hesitated. For the first time since she had known him, uncertainty flickered across his expression. Because, he said carefully. Someone told me I should. Louisa looked up sharply. Who? He crossed the room toward the window again. My sister. You have a sister? Lady Catherine Montclair. Louisa recognized the name instantly, a celebrated beauty in Parisian society. She stared at him. She told you to stop paying your debts? She told me I was destroying what remained of the Somerset name. Julian's voice had grown quiet. She said if I continued selling land, there would soon be nothing left for the family. Louisa's stomach tightened. And you listened? At the time, he said simply. I believed she might be right. Louisa closed the ledger slowly. My brother died trying to repay the debts he owed because of you. Julian's jaw tightened. I know. But you stopped. Yes. The admission was brutal. Louisa's anger surged again. Then perhaps society was correct about you. Julian did not react immediately. He walked back toward the desk and rested his hands against the polished wood. Perhaps it was. The calm acceptance disarmed her. You do not even defend yourself. I am tired of defending things that cannot be undone. His voice had grown rough. But if you wish to understand the truth... He paused. Something troubled crossed his face. My sister visited 3 years ago. Louisa waited. She brought newspapers. Julian's eyes darkened. Articles describing the men ruined by the consortium. Louisa's heart tightened. And Jonathan? Julian's gaze fell. Yes. A chill spread through Louisa. What did they say? Julian hesitated. Then he spoke the words quietly. They said he had taken ill shortly after returning to Boston. Louisa's throat tightened. They also wrote, Julian continued slowly, that he had spent his final months attempting to repay creditors who had threatened legal action against your family. Louisa's hands trembled. That is true. Julian's voice softened. The article called him an honorable man. Silence filled the room. Louisa blinked hard. You kept that article? Yes. Why? Julian's answer came without hesitation. Because it reminded me what honor actually looks like. The word struck deeper than she expected. Louisa turned away, pressing a hand against the shelf to steady herself. This was not how vengeance was supposed to feel. Hatred was meant to burn bright and certain. Instead, every conversation with the Duke seemed to blur the lines she had drawn so carefully. Behind her, Julian spoke again. There is something else you should know. Louisa looked back. What? He hesitated, then said quietly, I attempted to repay your brother's debt. The room seemed to tilt. What? 3 months after I learned he had died. Louisa stared at him, but the money never arrived. Julian nodded once. My solicitor informed me the payment was refused. Her breath caught. Refused? The letter said the Harding family would accept nothing from the man responsible for their ruin. Louisa felt the floor drop from beneath her. My father, she whispered. Julian's voice softened. I suspected as much. The truth hung between them like a wound reopening. Louisa had crossed an ocean believing the Duke had abandoned her brother entirely. But now the past looked far less simple than she had believed. And for the first time since arriving at Glenmore, she realized something terrifying. The story she carried in her heart might not be the whole truth. Julian closed the cabinet quietly. I did not tell you this to defend myself, he said. I told you because secrets rot like the rest of this house. Louisa stared at the locked cabinet, at the hundreds of names written in careful ink, and suddenly she understood something she had not expected. The Duke of Somerset had not forgotten the people he ruined. He had built an entire room to remember them. And somewhere among those pages, her brother's name had been waiting. Rain arrived that evening like a curtain pulled across the highlands. Wind rattled the tall windows of Glenmore Manor, and the great house groaned as though the storm were stirring its bones awake. Louisa sat alone in the small sitting room beside the library, the ledger still resting on her lap. Jonathan Harding. The name stared up at her in Julian's careful handwriting. Beneath it, investment, 3,200. Status, unpaid. And beside that, written more faintly, almost as if the pen had hesitated, deceased. Louisa's throat tightened. For months she had imagined the Duke as a man who had forgotten her brother the moment the venture collapsed. But this looked like something else entirely. Footsteps sounded behind her. She did not need to turn to know who it was. You found the entry, Julian said quietly. Louisa closed the ledger. Yes. He remained standing near the doorway, as though uncertain whether he had the right to enter. That hesitation unsettled her more than arrogance would have. You tried to repay the debt, she said. I did. And my father refused. Julian inclined his head slightly. Your father's pride was understandable. Louisa stood abruptly. No. The word came sharper than she intended. My father refused because he hated you. Julian did not argue. Hatred, he said softly, is often easier than grief. Louisa turned away toward the rain-streaked windows. Jonathan admired you. I know. He believed in your vision. I know. Her voice broke slightly. He would not have refused the money. Julian's silence was answer enough. The thought struck her suddenly, painfully. My father never told me, she whispered. Julian stepped a little closer. I suspected he would not. Why? Because accepting the money might have meant accepting that I had tried. The words landed heavily between them. Louisa wrapped her arms around herself. So all this time? Her voice faltered. I believed you abandoned him. Julian looked down. I abandoned many people, but not him. His jaw tightened. I failed him. The distinction hung in the air. Louisa studied him carefully. Rain flashed against the windows behind him, lightning illuminating the sharp planes of his face. For the first time since arriving at Glenmore, she truly saw the exhaustion etched into every line of him. You could have told me sooner, she said quietly. Julian shook his head. You came here for vengeance. And? I believed you deserved the truth only when you were ready to hear it. Louisa let out a slow breath. And you think I am ready now? No. His answer was immediate. I think you are angry enough to listen. A humorless smile tugged at her lips. That is not the same thing. No. Another silence fell between them. But this one felt different. Less like a battlefield, more like uncertain ground neither of them understood yet. Finally, Louisa spoke again. Why did you keep the ledger? Julian looked toward the locked cabinet across the room. Because forgetting would have been easier. And you chose not to forget. I chose not to deserve peace. Louisa felt something twist in her chest. You punish yourself. Yes. Every day. Yes. Her voice softened. For how long? Julian's answer came without hesitation. For the rest of my life. The certainty of it unsettled her deeply. You think suffering balances the scales? No. He met her gaze directly now. I think suffering reminds me why the scales exist. Louisa stared at him. The storm outside seemed to quiet slightly, leaving only the steady whisper of rain. You are not the man I expected to find here, she said finally. Julian's expression darkened faintly. I suspect that disappoints you. It confuses me. That, he murmured, is far more dangerous. Louisa frowned. Why? Because confusion breeds sympathy. She felt heat rise to her face. I do not sympathize with you. Julian's lips curved faintly. You cleaned an entire wing of the house this week. That was practical. You asked about my sister. Curiosity. You read my ledger. That was... She stopped. Julian watched her calmly. Human, he finished quietly. The word unsettled her. Louisa turned abruptly toward the fireplace. You mistake my intentions, Your Grace. Do I? Yes. I hope so. She looked back sharply. Why? Julian's voice lowered. Because if you ever began to see me as something other than the villain of your story, his eyes held hers in the flickering firelight, you might discover something far more inconvenient. Louisa's pulse quickened. And what is that? Julian hesitated. For the first time since she had met him, uncertainty crossed his face. That I am only a man, he said softly. The words lingered in the room. Louisa suddenly became very aware of how close he stood, close enough that she could see the faint scar near his temple. Close enough to hear the steadiness of his breathing. Close enough to realize something deeply unsettling. She no longer wanted to hurt him, and that frightened her more than anything else. Because vengeance had been the only thing that carried her across the ocean. If she lost that, then she would have to face a truth far more dangerous. The Duke of Somerset might not be her enemy anymore. And if he was not, she did not yet know what he had become. The following evening, Glenmore Manor hosted its first visitors in years. Word traveled quickly through small Highland villages, and the sight of lights burning in the old Somerset estate had stirred curiosity. 2 neighboring landowners had arrived under the polite pretense of checking on the Duke's health. In truth, they had come to see whether the rumors were true, whether the fallen Duke had finally lost his mind, or whether the mysterious American woman now living under his roof had something to do with it. Louisa stood near the tall windows of the drawing room, painfully aware of every whisper drifting through the chamber. Silver chandeliers flickered above. A fire crackled in the marble hearth. The room had been hastily restored for the evening, but the tension beneath the polished surface was unmistakable. Across the room, Julian Ashford spoke quietly with Lord Hargrove, a broad man whose curious gaze had already drifted toward Louisa more than once. "You have been absent from society, Somerset," Hargrove remarked. "I have been occupied." "With what?" Julian lifted his glass but did not drink. "Repairing things." The man chuckled softly. "That sounds suspiciously like work." Julian's voice remained calm. "It is." Meanwhile, Louisa endured the uncomfortable scrutiny of Lady Margaret Hargrove. The woman's eyes were sharp. "And you are American, I hear." "Yes." "And you reside here?" "For the time being." Lady Margaret's brow lifted. "How unusual." Louisa met the woman's gaze evenly. "So I have been told." The older woman studied her a moment longer. "Forgive my curiosity, Miss Harding, but Glenmore has not welcomed a guest in quite some time." "I did not come as a guest." The remark slipped out before Louisa could soften it. Lady Margaret's lips curved slightly. "No," she murmured. "I suspect not." Across the room, Julian noticed the exchange. His posture shifted subtly. A protective tension entered his shoulders. Lord Hargrove followed his gaze. "Your American companion seems formidable." Julian's answer came without hesitation. "She is." "May I ask how she came to stay here?" Julian paused. Then he spoke plainly. "She crossed the Atlantic to confront me." Hargrove blinked. "About what?" Julian's voice lowered. "A debt." The word spread through the room like spilled wine. Lady Margaret turned sharply. "A debt?" Julian set his untouched glass aside. "Yes." He crossed the room slowly. Louisa felt the air change as he approached. The quiet confidence of a man accustomed to command had returned, subtle but unmistakable. He stopped beside her. "Miss Harding," he said. She looked up. "Your Grace." Lord Hargrove frowned slightly. "Somerset, are you suggesting—" "Yes." Julian did not let him finish. His voice was steady. "The Harding family lost everything because of my failed consortium." Louisa's breath caught. She had not expected him to say it aloud. Not here, not in front of witnesses. The room fell silent. Lady Margaret studied them both carefully. "And Miss Harding has come to demand justice?" Julian answered before Louisa could. "She came to ensure I remember." Lord Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. "That seems severe." Julian's gaze remained forward. "It is deserved." Louisa felt her chest tighten. For weeks he had carried his guilt quietly within the walls of Glenmore. But here, in the presence of society, he did not hide from it. Lady Margaret turned to Louisa again. "And have you found satisfaction in this arrangement?" Louisa hesitated. All eyes were on her now. This was the moment she had once dreamed of. The opportunity to expose the Duke of Somerset before his peers, to force him to face public humiliation. Instead, she heard herself say something entirely different. "No." The word surprised even her. Lady Margaret tilted her head. "No?" Louisa's voice steadied. "I have found the truth." Julian glanced at her. Something unspoken passed between them. The room held its breath. "And what truth is that?" Lord Hargrove asked. Louisa met his gaze calmly. "That ruin rarely belongs to one man alone." The statement rippled through the chamber. Julian looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Lady Margaret leaned back slightly, studying them both with newfound interest. "Well," she murmured, "this evening has grown unexpectedly fascinating." The tension in the room eased slightly, though curiosity still lingered. Conversation resumed cautiously, but the moment between Louisa and Julian did not fade. When the guests finally departed an hour later, the manor fell silent again. Louisa stood alone in the drawing room when Julian returned from seeing them out. "You did not have to defend me," he said quietly. "I did not." "You could have." "Yes." He studied her carefully. "Why didn't you?" Louisa walked slowly toward the window. Rain had stopped. Moonlight spilled across the moor. "I came here believing you were a monster," she said. "And now?" She turned to face him. Now the truth trembled dangerously close to the surface. "You are far more difficult than that." Julian's voice softened. "Difficult? You are a man who regrets. And that makes things worse?" "Yes." She stepped closer. "Because monsters are easy to hate." Their eyes met. "And you are not." For a long moment neither moved. The distance between them had grown dangerously small. Julian's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Louisa." It was the first time he had spoken her name without formality. The sound of it sent a shiver through her. She should step away. She did not. "I came here to make you remember my brother," she said softly. "And I do." "I know." Silence filled the room. Then Julian spoke the truth he had been holding back for weeks. I think about him every day. Louisa's breath trembled. And about you. The words hung between them, heavy, unavoidable, and for the first time since she crossed the ocean, Louisa realized something terrifying. The man she had come to destroy might now be the only person in the world who truly understood her grief. The confession lingered in the quiet drawing room like the final note of a violin. Julian Ashford had not meant to say it aloud. Yet now the truth existed between them, impossible to retrieve. And about you. Louisa stood very still. Outside, the Scottish Highlands lay silver beneath the moon, the long grasses shifting in the night wind like restless ghosts. You should not think about me, she said softly. Julian did not move. I know. And yet you do. Yes. There was no apology in his voice, only honesty. Louisa felt something inside her unravel. A tight knot she had carried since the day Jonathan's coffin arrived in Boston. For months, anger had been the only thing that made sense. Hatred had given her direction, purpose. Without it, she felt frighteningly unmoored. You confuse me, she admitted. Julian almost smiled. I confuse myself most days. You ruined my brother's life. Yes. And yet, her voice faltered, and yet you carry his memory as if it belongs to you. Julian's gaze dropped briefly to the floor. In a way, he said quietly. It does. He crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet from her, close enough that the firelight caught the deep green of his eyes. Jonathan Harding believed in a better world, Julian continued. He believed men could rise beyond the circumstances of their birth. Louisa felt her throat tighten. That belief destroyed him. No. Julian shook his head. The world destroyed him. The distinction mattered more than she wanted it to. He continued softly. I only help the world do its work. Louisa stared at him. You refuse to absolve yourself. I refuse to lie. Silence settled again, but this time it was different. No longer tense, no longer defensive. It felt like the fragile pause between two lives shifting direction. Finally, Louisa spoke the question she had avoided since arriving at Glenmore. What happens now? Julian looked genuinely uncertain. I do not know. That is not very reassuring. It is honest. He glanced toward the dark windows. I suppose I continue trying to repay the debts I can. And the ones you cannot? His answer came quietly. I live with them. Louisa studied him for a long moment. Then she said the words that surprised even herself. You should return to London. Julian looked startled. Why? Because hiding here accomplishes nothing. His expression hardened slightly. You believe society will welcome me back? No. Then why suggest it? Louisa stepped closer. Because redemption cannot happen in isolation. Julian absorbed the words slowly. You think redemption is possible? She hesitated. The question carried more weight than either of them expected. I think effort is possible, she said at last. And sometimes effort is enough. Julian studied her carefully. And you? What about me? What happens to you when this house no longer needs haunting? The faint humor in his voice did not hide the deeper question beneath it. Louisa turned toward the fire. For the past 6 months I have lived for one purpose. Vengeance. Yes. And now? She let out a slow breath. I do not know who I am without it. Julian stepped closer. You are the bravest woman I have ever met. That is a terrible qualification. It is the only one that matters. Louisa turned back to him. Their eyes met again. This time neither looked away. You once asked why I stayed, she said. Yes. I thought I remained here to ensure you remembered my brother. And now? Louisa felt the truth settle quietly inside her heart. Now I think I stayed because you already did. Julian's breath caught. The distance between them had vanished without either noticing. He spoke carefully as though afraid the moment might break. Louisa, if you ever decide to leave Glenmore, yes, I would understand. And if I stayed? His answer came almost immediately. Then I would spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it. The words were not grand. They carried no poetic flourish. Only quiet sincerity. Louisa studied his face in the firelight. The scars of regret were still there, the exhaustion, the guilt. But beneath them she saw something new, hope, fragile, terrifying, alive. She reached out slowly. Her hand brushed his sleeve. The contact sent a small shock through them both. You cannot undo what happened to Jonathan, she said softly. I know, but you can choose what happens next. Julian's voice dropped. And what do you choose? Louisa did not answer immediately. Outside, the wind swept across the dark Highland hills. The world beyond Glenmore Manor remained uncertain, difficult, unforgiving. But for the first time since her brother's death, Louisa Harding did not feel entirely alone within it. "I choose," she said quietly, "to see what kind of man the Duke of Somerset becomes." Julian exhaled slowly. Relief flickered across his face. "That is more mercy than I deserve." "It is not mercy." "What is it?" Louisa allowed the faintest smile. "A second chance." The fire burned low. Beyond the windows, dawn began its slow rise over the Scottish moor. And somewhere between grief and forgiveness, between vengeance and redemption, two broken lives began the uncertain work of becoming something new.